Okay, so I think everyone can see this.
And the next slide.
Excellent. Okay. So thanks for coming along to our second Inspiring Populations talk. My name's David McCollum, and I'm the current chair of the Population Geography Research Group. Thanks to Paula Duffy for putting this funky slide at the start together. So what I'm going to talk about over the next, hopefully not too long, 20 minutes or so, is to just give an overview of some research I've been recently doing, which was looking at post-pandemic geographies of home and work relations. So I've used the French idiom here, plus ça change, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, which effectively means the more things change, the more they stay the same in terms of spatial inequalities. So I think the point I'm getting at is in the talk is that we've had a massive transformation in terms of how and where work is done, but yet in terms of social and spatial inequalities, effectively not that much might not have changed, unfortunately. So this work is based on a one-year British Academy Fellowship that I was undertaking up until September last year. So this time last year I was actually down in Rushcliffe. I'm not sure if you know it. It's just across the River Trent from the central Nottingham, doing one of the workshops that constitute the data that I've got here. So this presentation today forms the basis of a paper which I started in September, then term started, and life got in the way. But I'm more or less finished this paper, I think. So I'd welcome your feedback on what I say this afternoon. Yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. For me, I'm getting your presenter mode. So I don't know if this is normal in Teams because I don't use Teams, but I'm getting your next slide and any possible notes as well.
We've got a fire alarm, so I've got to go. Sorry.
Okay, Tony. How do we fix that? Let's see. I
don't know if you can. I don't know if you're sharing on two screens. If you can choose, I don't know.
David, if you go to display settings in the middle.
Yes. Thanks, Sophie.
And then swap presenter and slideshow.
Wonderful. Well done, Sophie. Thank you very much. Expert. So ironically, this project, this talk is about working from home and technology, which, as you can see, I'm not brilliant with. So as I said, this time last year I was kind of doing data collection, and now it's very much back to the usual academic cycle of lots of admin, lots of teaching, and trying to do a bit of research when we get the time. So what I'll talk about for the next 20 minutes or so is basically working from home, something we're all familiar with. It came about very abruptly, of course, almost 4 years ago exactly this week, when the Prime Minister basically instructed us to stay at home and work from home if we could do so. So, of course, this potentially means quite a lot in terms of a potential reconfiguration of the geographies of homework relations. So I'll say a little bit about that, then I'll move on to talk about in theory, what this might mean for spatial inequalities. So I suppose the idea would be that if people can work anywhere, then potentially human capital might be spread more evenly across the country. And of course, that would be good for things like regional inequalities. I'll talk about the methods that have been employed in the research. And then in terms of the findings, I'll talk about the relationship between working from home and spatial inequalities, particularly in the context of the levelling up agenda, which you're probably all familiar with, and also in relation to Scotland around issues of population sustainability. In very crude terms, we look at this through the lens of hotspots for remote working and cool spots where by far the majority of the population did not and do not work from home. And then I'll try and come up with some conclusions with regards to what working from home has meant for regional inequalities and how we might kind of develop a research agenda in this particular field moving forward. So where better to start a presentation on levelling up than a quote from the legend that is Madonna. So you can see the quotation here. Basically, in the paper, I've also got quotations from Michael Gove, who ironically now is in charge of levelling up, the governor of New York, all sorts of kind of prominent people at the start of the pandemic, basically talking about the pandemic and COVID as being the kind of the great leveler, the idea that it didn't respect borders, didn't respect race, ethnicity, social class. The idea was that we're all in this together. And of course, in retrospect, we know, and it shouldn't come as a massive surprise to anyone, that in terms of health and other outcomes from the pandemic, some places and some population subgroups managed that much more effectively than others. So I thought it was a useful starting point in terms of thinking about this. And in terms of the research itself, I was intrigued by popular media stories at the start of the pandemic of young families moving away from London and other big cities. Because they discovered that if you're doing all of the work online anyway, then why stay in a large, congested, expensive city? So there are stories in the press of families moving from London to buy big houses in Scarborough or Middlesbrough and things like that. So that was kind of the stuff that kind of intrigued me to look at this through a project. So just very briefly, this is a brief history lesson. Apologies in advance for any inaccuracies here. Probably explains why I'm a population geographer and not a historian. But very roughly, up until about the development of agriculture about 10,000 years ago, we were largely hunter-gatherers, which meant that we lived nomadic lifestyles, moved around in search of food, basically looking for things to kill and to eat. About 10,000 years ago, we discovered agriculture, which basically means we settle down. And by and large, for the next 10,000 years, there's a very close relationship for most people in most places between where they live and where they work. Of course, before COVID comes along, advancements in information communications technology loosened that relationship. So, of course, we shouldn't be naive and think that working from home didn't exist before COVID. But of course, with the arrival of the pandemic, we see this significant shift in working practices and associated residential preferences, and potentially a reconfiguration of the geographical relationship between place of work and place of home, a potential loosening of this relationship. By and large, of course, there's a big change, but there's an interesting quotation here I quite like from Gian Parry and colleagues at the University of Southampton, which basically talks about hybrid working being the new workforce expectation, a permanent mind shift around where and how work can be organised, and finally, the grand experiment that nobody wanted has worked. But of course, as we know, in terms of the geographies of working from home, as I'll demonstrate in a second, we have very big spatial disparities in that. And in terms of population subgroups, big differences as well in who was able to work remotely during the pandemic and, of course, afterwards as well. And I think a key point to remember when we're thinking about discussions about the so-called new normal of working from home is that most people, even at most people in the workforce, even at the height of the pandemic, never actually worked from home. And that's a point that sometimes I think can be lost as part of these discussions. So in terms of what I'm going to focus on today, I think the key question in the context of this paper is, will the ability to work from home lead to greater opportunities for places to attract and therefore retain human capital? And what might this mean for regional inequalities in the UK? In terms of the existing literature on this topic, we can see kind of a bit of a split between more optimistic and more pessimistic perceptions. So a lot of this work, you can see the dates on the citations here. A lot of this was conducted during the pandemic as opposed to post-pandemic. So some of these ideas are a little bit speculative in nature. But on a positive note, there's the idea that with the ability to work from home, that leads to greater residential choice for many workers, and therefore we will see a lower price premium on those parts which are closest to the bigger cities, and therefore gentrification potentially of urban areas and a shift away with economic activity from the bigger cities towards suburbs and residential areas as well. So these are quite positive perceptions of the changes in the sense that economic activity and human capital, because of the ability to work in effect anywhere, will lead to less spatial inequalities within somewhere like the UK. On a less positive note, there's interesting ideas from Bondsmith and McCann, who basically, quite astutely note the ongoing popularity of hybrid working. So hybrid working is where someone still goes to work on a pretty frequent basis, So that is much more commonplace than fully remote working, which has implications for geography. So basically, because people still go to work on a pretty frequent basis, they still need to live within a commutable distance to their other place of work. So because of this, we see this kind of this ongoing dominance in terms of kind of the core periphery model, in terms of how cities and their peripheral hinterlands operate. And as a consequence, we see retention of human capital within London and its wider hinterland as well. Interestingly, we have the idea of so-called donut effects, and this is the idea that for hybrid workers, because they're not commuting on a daily basis, they're more tolerant of longer commutes. And this is something that I'll talk about when it comes to my findings as well in a moment. This is the idea that the kind of the travel to work areas around the big cities are expanding as a consequence of the take up of hybrid working. And I would just finish this section with a nice quote from Mike Brewer and colleagues at the Resolution Foundation, which basically kind of, I think, reiterates what I'm going to say when it comes to my conclusions as well, is that those areas and parts of the country which were doing well already are the places that are going to benefit largely from the transition to working from home. So they conclude that basically changes to the UK since early 2000 have had a minimal impact on spatial inequalities. In terms of the wider policy context for the work, I've mentioned the levelling up agenda. So this has been around for a few years now, was announced to great fanfare in 2022. And this basically relates to the recent politicalisation of long-standing regional inequalities in the UK. So these inequalities have been around for at least 50 years, but with the Brexit vote and the Red Wall kind of phenomenon in the 2019 general election, we see an increased kind of political attention being paid to levelling up and spatial inequalities. So within the Levelling Up document, we've got 12 stated missions to levelling up the economic opportunities in the UK by 2030. So it's very ambitious in that respect. And in relation to the present topic, there is the aspiration to support people to realise their career aspirations without having to leave their communities. And of course, the opportunity to work from home might be quite important within this. More broadly, within the Scottish context, you may be familiar that the Scottish Government is very concerned about population decline and population ageing in many parts of Scotland, particularly remote and rural areas. So potentially working from home could offer opportunities to address some of those demographic challenges. And that's something that I try and talk about in the paper as well. So in terms of methodologically approaching this topic, this was kind of a mixed methods approach, which combined secondary data analysis with qualitative primary data collection in so-called hotspots and cold spots for remote working. A problem potentially with the quantitative data, which I didn't necessarily anticipate when I was designing the research, is that a lot of this data refers to the period when we're very much under the pandemic restrictions, as opposed to understanding the new normal. So the qualitative stuff's probably more helpful in that respect. So I used the census in England and Wales. It's got a question on how people travel to work. And one of the options there is I work mostly or always from home. So from that, we're able to look and see what parts of the what parts of England and Wales had a high predominance of remote working and which places had very low levels. So I'll show you that in a second. In Scotland, of course, the census was postponed by a year, which basically meant that wasn't possible. So instead, I used population estimates from the National Records of Scotland, just looking at basically areas which had previously seen population decline, but we're now starting to see people moving into them potentially as a consequence of the ability to work from home. So I tried to explore that as well in the 3 case study areas you can see there. So it's a stakeholder-based approach, speaking to councils, community councils, think tanks, nationally and regionally, local employment partnerships, and of course to businesses and new and more established residents as well, to try and understand what was happening at the local scale and what the implications might be of being able to attract remote workers or otherwise. So just briefly in terms of the secondary data analysis, this chart is based on data from Understanding Society. So you have the annual waves And then, of course, during COVID, we had the special COVID waves as well. Two things are probably interesting here. First of all, on the green line, you've got the massive increase in people who were working from home as a consequence of the pandemic. Won't come as a massive surprise to anyone. But the red line is also interesting in the sense that the proportion of the workforce who never work from home never actually drops beneath 50%, which I think was quite important and quite interesting to note as well. Here is the geography of working from home. Sasa was saying in the census, there's a question which allows us to understand the proportion of the workforce who mostly or always work from home. And you can see basically that's very much concentrated in and around London. So basically you can take the 331 local authorities in England and Wales, you can draw the kind of conventional north-south divide from the Wash to the Severn Estuary, and only two areas sit north of that north-south divide within the UK. So that was quite stark, I thought, and that influenced where I did a lot of the data collection. In terms of cold spots, you can see kind of the east coast of England, from the Wash up to the Humber Estuary, and then going inland towards Stoke and Staffordshire and places like that as well. Just to illustrate that point, you can see kind of the top 10 for remote working. Again, the caveat here is that this is March 2021, so this covers the pandemic as opposed to post-pandemic. But you can see basically the top 10 in these local authority areas, more than half of the workforce work from home, and it's all in and around London and in quite prosperous areas. On the other hand, you can look at the bottom 10 for remote working. So Boston and Lincolnshire, only 6% of the workforce worked from home at the peak of the pandemic. And you can see other areas where working from home was not particularly prevalent at all. In England, the average was 32%, and in Wales, it was 26% of people who worked from home at the time of the census. And you can just see for some of the case study areas, the proportions who worked from home and how they rank in terms of their positioning from 1 to 331 in terms of local authorities in England and Wales. In terms of trying to explain who worked from home and where during the pandemic, I've looked at data from Understanding Society, from the census, and I think ultimately a lot of it boils down to area deprivation. So here you can basically see the index of multiple deprivation. This is for Bath and for Bristol. That's the coloured main image, and then to either side you can basically see shading for the proportion of the population at data zone level who worked from home at the time of the census. Perhaps we could look at the right-hand side for the city of Bath, and you can basically see blue equals less deprived, red equals more deprived, and Bath, as you're probably familiar, is quite a prosperous city. And you can basically see here, and for other parts of England and Wales, the geography of working from home maps very, very closely onto area deprivation. As I was saying, I've looked at this also at the individual level with Understanding Society data, and things like occupational status, education level are very strong predictors of the ability to work from home. And this basically just shows a correlation of that, indicating that there was much more remote working in less deprived areas than the inverse. Interestingly, the correlation between Brexit vote and working from home is a very, very tight correlation. I'm not entirely sure what to do with this analytically, but it's intriguing nonetheless. So that's just a quick summary of some of the quantitative stuff that I was looking at as part of this project. That's published in a paper in People, Place and Policy. That was published in the summer. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to have a look at that. That's basically taking the idea that within geography and within migration studies, mobilities have tended to be privileged, whereas during the pandemic, during a health crisis, it was that kind of relationship was reversed, whereby immobilities became privileged. So it tries to try and develop that point a little bit by kind of indicating social inequalities and who got to work from home during a health crisis. So as I was saying, kind of the caveat with a lot of this quantitative stuff is that it tells us what was happening during the pandemic, but not necessarily what was happening afterwards. Hence the reliance on a lot of the qualitative stuff. So I think I've maybe got half a dozen slides with some quotes in them, and I'll try and sum up in terms of thinking about what this might mean for inequalities. So of course there are all sorts of kind of complexities and nuances to this, but I quite like the quotation here from Rosie, who was from a national level think tank. And she, in this quotation, I think it pretty neatly sums up kind of what's happened in terms of working from home and geographical inequalities. So she talks about how you've got remote places, which are very aesthetically appealing. People are tolerant of long commuting distances from these types of places. However, that perhaps increases inequalities in house prices at these particular places because local wages in these types of areas are conventionally low. And then at the other end of the scale, you've got the places which have been bypassed by the working from home revolution. So she talks about basically no one is moving with any great salary to these kind of really left behind places. And I think, you know, as I'll say in the next couple of slides, there are all sorts of nuances to that, but that kind of effectively sums up kind of what I found in my research fellowship. So in terms of thinking about the places which are hotspots for remote working, you can think about probably three different things are going on. First of all, you've got relatively prosperous places which had a relatively qualified population. So people living in these places had jobs which were amenable to working from home. So of course the pandemic comes along and people in these places can relatively easily make the switch to working from home. But because of the nature of these places, they also attract residential relocations of people from bigger cities because of the residential attractiveness. And I suppose and the third type of thing which would be going on is you've got more remote places which are able to attract people who work fully remotely because they're very, very far away from centres of employment. So you've got that distinction between hybrid, which is more prevalent and means donut effects because people still have to commute. But you've also got fully remote, which is less prevalent, but has got a wider geographical implication because people are working almost completely remotely or very much remotely in these types of places, which means they're able to relocate further away from their place of work. So I've got some quotes on that in a second. So in terms of implications, you've got, as I said, you've got places which are amenable to switching to working from home and attracting people from other places. So quotation from Laura here kind of sums that up. There's a lot of people working from home in this place. It's very professional in terms of the jobs that people do. You've got the big Victorian houses with the spare rooms. And you've got this kind of liberal green vibe to it. And this is something that came out again and again when it came to the hotspots. This idea of attractiveness, cultural offer, etc. And this kind of has implications, I think, for spatial inequalities because the narrative at the start of the pandemic was that places which were kind of left behind would be able to attract remote workers on account of having lower housing costs and lower costs of living. But the data that I found was that in most cases, the vibe, the cultural offer is much more important than lower house costs, at least for the type of people who have the ability to work remotely. So you can kind of see the quote from Laura, which explains perhaps the attractiveness of certain types of places to remote workers. And I think a lot of this would have kind of echoes of the idea of Richard Florida's creative class hypothesis. So again, this is someone else in a hotspot, basically talking about their city benefiting from a flight from London. Those kind of cool professionals, quality of life, cost pressures, but it's basically got the same cultural offer. So basically talking about this city being able to attract people away from London, but having a kind of comparable urban area in terms of its feel and its cultural offer. And again, that's something that's going to be really important going forward in terms of place attractiveness and attracting potentially footloose professionals. So that's kind of some of the patterns we see in areas where hybrid working is more prevalent. I also talked about remote workers. And basically, this can present particular opportunities, but also challenges for places in terms of population sustainability. So the two quotes here relate to a remote island in Argyll and Bute in the west coast of Scotland. So you've basically got the quotation from Paul, which is talking about life course perspective being really important. So you've got basically someone who's older, who's got lots of experience, being able to kind of get away with some of the challenges that are associated with living very remotely and doing remote working from there. You've also got someone from the community council in this area talking about working from home presenting opportunities to be able to attract human capital to these types of places, because in the past they could attract one worker, but they didn't have a job for that person's partner, whereas the ability to work from home allows two people to move, and often they would bring children with them as well. So that's seen as being an advantage from that point of view. However, in terms of population sustainability, if we think about who's able to work remotely, it tends to be people who are more qualified and at a later stage in their lives. So there's quite a lengthy quote here, apologies for that, from Daniela in an rural town in Dumfries and Galloway, basically talking about the town is appealing. The population has increased since COVID, but you can look at the characteristics of the people who have come in. It's a certain age, a certain social class. So you've got the lawyers, the semi-retired architects and journalists and things like that. So there's an influx of people, but they tend to be age 55 or over, and from a certain class structure as well. So this basically means that people have come to these types of places, but they tend to be close to retirement age, not have young children with them, and be quite wealthy as well, which has an inflationary impact on house prices in these types of places, which can exacerbate some of the existing challenges there around population sustainability. And then finally, of course, it's worth, I think, reflecting quite carefully on what the working from home revolution means for the places which are completely bypassed by it. So in these places, you've got kind of two challenges. First of all, you have a lot of agricultural jobs, warehousing jobs, infrastructure jobs, which are not amenable to working from home. Then you've got the second issue, which is that despite their cost advantages, they have not been able to attract human capital from more expensive parts of the country. So I've kind of characterized this in the quotation from Stephen around kind of pulse versus price. So basically, Stephen's talking about, in terms of cost of living, housing affordability, they've been attracting some people to their area. However, their area doesn't have the same vitality, the same pulse as other types of places do, and therefore they've struggled to attract the people that are able to work from home. And I quite like the quotation from Caroline and Ethan down at the bottom here, which again is one of these kind of places which might be characterized as left behind, in the sense that, you know, Caroline's talking about, we've got a reputation, and that makes it hard to attract people to our area. But then Ethan very enthusiastically interjects to talk about, you know, it works both ways. There's an assumption in the north that we're struggling, in the south there's this plethora of people, you know, wandering around in streets paved with gold, and that working from home will spread these quality people around the country, and that we're very lucky to get someone from the south coming here. So from Ethan and from other interviewees, there was kind of a rejection of this idea of a valorization of remote working and its potential for leveling up. So just to try and conclude then, I welcome your thoughts in a moment. You've kind of used the term plus ça change, in the sense that, you know, the more things change, the more they stayed the same. So we have this very significant change in employment practices and also residential preferences as a consequence of the pandemic. However, in terms of their effects on social and spatial inequalities, you know, unfortunately, it seems that these largely mirror, and in some cases exacerbate, these existing long-standing inequalities. So the ability of working from home to kind of transform the economic geography of the UK is perhaps limited, and certainly more limited than I hoped it might have been at the start of the project. But I think also within this context, we have to be careful about kind of over fetishizing the potential of working from home to kind of transform the geographies of home and work relations. And I suppose the key points here would be emphasizing that it's only a majority of people and places where working from home actually happened. So most people didn't work from home, and in only about, I think it's 15 out of the 331 local authorities in England and Wales did more than half of the population work from home during the pandemic. And of course, it's declined a little bit since then. It's also kind of thinking about, in terms of what's going to happen going forward. So fully remote working is a thing, but only about 10 or 15% of the workforce actually do it. Hybrid working is much more prevalent and is much more likely to last for longer, over the longer term. So hybrid, of course, means someone travels to an office or another workplace kind of 2 or 3 or 4 days a week, but works at home sometimes as well. So this basically means a resilience probably of the core periphery economic model within the UK and elsewhere, but an increased emphasis on place attractiveness for those footloose and relatively skilled and relatively well-paid workers who do have more autonomy in terms of where and when they do their work. So probably what we might see is this idea of kind of expanding donuts, which is maybe an interesting analogy. It might explode, but you kind of might see kind of these donuts becoming increasingly prominent, and an emphasis on kind of culturally attractive places, again, trying to attract this kind of creative class. So that's kind of a summary of what we've found. Of course, this is an emerging area of research, and a lot of the time these sort of studies can raise as many questions as they answer. So fortunately, we've got a new ESRC project start working with colleagues at Southampton, Oxford, De Montfort, and one other university. I forgot what it is. Apologies. Oh, Birmingham. Basically, where we are going to look at what constitutes place attractiveness for footloose workers. So where are footloose workers moving to and why? And we're also trying to look at the policy tools which cities can use and other places can use to try and attract and retain this type of human capital. We're also trying to understand what the local effects of an increased prevalence of working from home might be. I think in this project, I've probably been guilty of assuming that it has all sorts of positive effects in terms of local spending, etc. But perhaps that this might just result in kind of more low-paid service sector jobs as opposed to kind of meaningful economic development for these types of places. Then, of course, this research and a lot of research which preceded it basically hasn't necessarily picked up on fully post-pandemic geographies of work from home, because in many ways the dust is still settling from a lot of those changes that we saw during the pandemic. And on that note, it's perhaps worth echoing Michael, who basically talks about, the famous quotation where the Chinese diplomat was kind of asked about the effects of the French Revolution, and he talks about it being too early to say. So perhaps this is going to take a while probably to figure out kind of this kind of potentially new and reconfigured geography of work and home, and what that means for population sustainability in places like Scotland and regional inequalities in places like England and Wales. So that was a very quick run through of the project, and I just I'd welcome your comments and your feedback, please. Hebe, if you get your hand up. Oh, you're clapping. Oh, thank you. Does anyone want to comment or ask a question? Teresa.
Hello, that was brilliant. Thank you. Really interesting. And maybe you cover this in the future, but I was actually interested in what I would call warm spots. So,
Yeah.
So they seem to be the areas where there might be possibility, let's call it, or potential for investment. That might be where, if there's investment, things might change. They could become more culturally attractive if they're already attractive. They already have this kind of place attractiveness. So what do warm spots look like? Or is that, it's not a trick question. And then what might be the kind of, what do you think the policy instruments, or what policy things might change those places to become hotspots? Yeah,
really good point. So I suppose, first of all, the distinction probably between warm and hot is a vague one, in the sense that if we think about the census map, the very hot spots were kind of around M25, basically, and I think I made a deliberate choice to not go there, in the sense that, as you know, London's a large global city with very particular things going on. So I kind of tried to position the research roughly along that axis, kind of the north-south kind of diagonal divide. And so I think some of the places that I was looking at probably were potentially warm as opposed to hot. But I think in terms of kind of attracting, making them hot, there's a real dilemma, I think, when it comes to things like levelling up, and I don't necessarily have an obvious answer to it, in the sense that within the levelling up agenda, you've got an emphasis, a recognition on kind of what places look like and feel like I think. So within the document, it talks about making places, aesthetically attractive. So you've got, in some of the levelling up funding, would go to kind of making town centres, look nicer places to be. So cleaning up graffiti, hanging baskets of flowers, this sort of stuff. But I suppose that can be perhaps critiqued in the sense that, okay, that's not going to change the structural challenges that these sorts of places faced in terms of chronic underinvestment, in terms of educational outcomes and stuff like that as well. So I think in the short term, you can make things maybe look nice and feel nice, which may or may not be successful in attracting certain types of people to those places. And then I think the question which follows on from that is, even if we are able to attract these types of workers, does that automatically equal economic growth for these types of places? And that's something I think that this research hasn't been able to answer, and I hope the subsequent project can kind of impact on that a little bit, in the sense that if someone's job is still in Birmingham or London, but they live in Staffordshire, what does that mean for economic prosperity in rural Staffordshire? Because I suppose they're still spending a lot of the time commuting and in central London. And in terms of measuring productivity, is that measured according to where they live or where they work as well? So I think there's a lot of stuff to try and kind of iron out, probably in that respect too.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, because these donut places, they've obviously gained some momentum from where they are placed, and they've drawn that, and it's drawn outwards, obviously. But then what, it's kind of what gives that momentum? What is that change? What are those areas that there has been change? What is it that's changed, that's given them the momentum to be warmer? It's really interesting. Thanks, David.
Yeah, and I think it just chimes back to the idea of vibe and reputation and scene. They talk about the scene in certain places, and I suppose it's probably, you can be flippant and dismiss that, but I think there might be something to that, in the sense that places have a reputation as being kind of, for young, cool professionals, as being places that are good to live in terms of that cultural offer. So. And again, I'm conscious of kind of the critiques of kind of the creative class idea, in the sense that, if we put up a nice museum, okay, will that transform the economic fortunes of the city? Perhaps not. But that might be something that kind of in the short term might be something that might kind of happen in that respect. And I suppose from a policymaker's point of view, that's probably easier to do than try and change these sort of things. And as I say, regional inequalities have been around the UK since the 70s, 80s, 60s. They're kind of quite entrenched in many cases, and it will take long-term structural change, as opposed to trying to change things by 2030. We can put hanging baskets by 2030, but we can't kind of change the educational system.
Yeah, absolutely.
In that context as well. But yeah, that's a really nice point, actually.
Thank you.
I think kind of like cold and hot's probably too simplistic, and I acknowledge that, I think. Rhys?
And again, sort of aligns with some data we've got from about 2019 about sort of similar things around, again, moving, it doesn't transform the broader I guess, reputation and challenges, structural inequalities of an area. I've got two questions, if that's okay. First of all, again, I noticed in the map, and I was intensely, when you see a map, you tend to try and look at any patterns. And I just wondered, in terms of some of the rural warm spots or hot spots, how do these align with places like areas of natural beauty or national parks? Again, sort of just drawn to the area I grew up, which was sort of in the Brecon Beacons, and noticed that was actually seemed to be quite dark. And I just wondered if that was if there was some kind of pattern there, or if that was just almost me being drawn to the one-off. Secondly, the question I'm going to ask is, do you have any data on things like house prices and stuff here? Is this following through, and on those as well? Is that also potentially creating an issue around people potentially being priced out of the market, but also in some instances houses not selling because people are. Some anecdotal evidence from around here certainly is that a few years ago, houses weren't selling and they were much cheaper. And then you had a growth in the pandemic, and now people are holding out for what they could get rather than what they are going to get, and that's had an impact on the market there as well.
Thanks, Rhys. Yes, in terms of the first point, kind of there's that kind of is that interesting thing when it comes to those kind of aesthetically appealing rural areas. So this came out in my data much probably more in the Scottish context than the stuff I was looking at in England and Wales. So the England and Wales stuff, I tended to focus mainly on urban areas. Whereas in Scotland, we had rural Dumfries and Galloway, rural Ayrshire, rural Argyll and Bute. And I think before the pandemic, the real issues around housing affordability in these types of places anyway. So I think, you know, local people wanted to live in and stay in these types of places, but the unavailability of affordable housing made that hard. Then with the pandemic, you get people who are at a certain stage in their career and their life course. So young people, I didn't talk about this in the presentation, but young people still want to go to big cities, because that's part of a rite of passage probably, as you know, as growing up. Whereas older people basically might have moved to these types of places anyway, but because they're able to work remotely, they're moving to these places while still economically active. Well, I suppose that's a good thing. You've got people going there and they're still working. The limitation in the sense is that you've got a lot of people basically moving from cities, London, Birmingham, Glasgow, Edinburgh, and they're basically selling up in these sorts of places. And if you go to an island or a rural part of Scotland, basically your money will take you very far in the sense of buying up in these types of places. So house prices rocketed in this over the pandemic in rural areas. So in the Revolution Foundation report from Mike Brewer that I cited, basically there they talk about an influx of people to remote areas, southwest England, parts of rural Scotland, and it was somewhere in Wales as well, although forgive me, I've forgotten where exactly, where basically you've got incomers coming in, and basically local wages are not high in these types of places, but the incomers have got lots of capital to basically push up house prices. You asked about what's happening now, and I have to confess I'm not so sure about what's happened more recently in the housing market in these types of places, because I guess kind of the people who were going to move have moved to these types of places, and kind of that's maybe might be a one-off perhaps in terms of that population movement. So I'd be intrigued to know what's happening there. Do you have any thoughts, Rhys, on what you think, what might be going on?
Certainly, I guess here is, as I said, it seems to be sort of people holding out of what they theoretically could get based on the fact that, well, a year ago somebody else in the village sold up for this amount of money, and almost holding out for that. But again, that's fairly anecdotal, but seems to be, say, people moving to work remotely is a small but steady.
Thanks, Rhys. Sergey, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I don't know. Has Rhys finished? Sorry, I wasn't sure.
Yeah, sorry, Rhys, your internet connection wasn't great there.
I think he disappeared. Yeah, thanks, David. It was really interesting, and thank you for it's impressive work. You've done lots of analysis, both qualitative and quantitative. I've got fundamental questions for you as usual. It's just I wanted to ask you a question whether you kind of looked at the COVID itself as you expect change to happen, aren't you? But it was hailed as a sort of dramatic change, which is going to make us all sustainable. We're going to live happily ever after. It's going to be a green, pleasant future with, we're going to change our lifestyles and everything else. And looking back, nothing of that actually happened. So I wonder whether when you look at COVID and expect change to happen, whether you're expecting too much. In a sense, then your findings are kind of playing along with this concept, view of COVID as not a dramatic transformation, as not something which led us to move away from different kind of unsustainable living and so on, or different ways of relating to homes. The second question I have for you is in relation to kind of your idea of home. I wonder whether you want to spend a bit more time, maybe in your paper, if you write it, to think about different critical kind of meanings of home, because it seems like you assumed home, you assume home to be a pretty much sedentary kind of concept. So something which has got walls, physical structure, and so on. While again, working in migration, you always question this idea. There's lots of work going on in terms of kind of understanding of idea of home is hybrid and changeable, and especially for people who live on the move, it can be anywhere in a sense. Lots of different kind of. So I wonder whether you want to make it a little bit more nuanced and sort of think about this relationship between home and work, and not as straightforward and categorical as it might appear to be. So just think about, thinking about home as something which is much more fluid and flexible, hybrid to start with. So then becomes hybrid kind of relationship if you apply your categorizations. So hybrid working and a hybrid home becomes kind of what is that? What are we talking about? And the last thing I wanted to ask you is a relation. What is inequality in your concept? So you kind of looking at the point of view of using the index of deprivation, but mostly in qualitative interviews, it comes up as house prices, food banks. I've only seen what you quote there, and I wonder what you want to think about inequality in a different context there as well, not something which is necessarily related maybe to material kind of gains and material possession, dispossession, accumulation. These kind of all ideas which are related to sort of economic view of inequality, but more of a kind of things which are which talk about well-being, broader things related to mental health, which really became an issue, isn't it, in COVID? The sense of fear, unsettlement, anxiety, where, different things play into it, and where maybe the balance, maybe the picture is going to be a bit different. So I wonder whether you want to kind of basically suspend these three things, kind of question these three concepts: COVID, home, and inequality. I've got a few other questions, but I'll let you know later. I just don't want to steal it. But it's really interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Sergey. Yeah, maybe to take the last one first of all, then the idea of kind of inequality, and I think I've tried to kind of avoid trying to talk about what inequality actually is, in the sense of trying to say it's about education outcomes or health outcomes or average wages and this kind of stuff. I think I've tried to avoid that in the sense it's maybe about a feel of places being different, and that idea of kind of reputation. A lot of people, like I spoke to people in Lincolnshire and Stoke and Humberside, and they talk about the kind of the reputation of the places kind of not being good, and kind of what that means for those types of places. But I like your point, Sergey, about kind of what it's like to be in a place, and I think that idea of kind of geographical inequalities probably didn't pan out so straightforwardly in the Scottish context, in the sense that you can think about kind of towards the east in Scotland, you've got Aberdeen, Aberdeenshire, Edinburgh, Lothians would be much higher in a lot of those indicators in terms of incomes and things like that. But if you talk about kind of well-being, you're thinking about a lot of the places I went to. But they would rank lower in kind of the more kind of the hard indicators and that sort of stuff. And I think you're right in the sense of COVID kind of probably. I think a lot of the stuff that came out was that COVID made people reevaluate, I think, what was important perhaps in their lives. So I think a lot of people were on the rat race in cities, kind of living fast, working all the time, and then maybe in terms of time, which I know you're familiar with, Sergey, in terms of conceptualizing that, kind of things stayed still for a while, and then basically they're thinking, okay, well, why am I working 12-hour days, 6 days a week? I want to move somewhere which is nice, where I can walk on a beach every morning, and I want fresh air. And a lot of people, I think, had that kind of that shift. But I suppose maybe from an inequalities point of view, some people were able to realize that aspiration and others weren't. So I think in terms of inequalities, there's maybe two different things going on there, in the sense of you've kind of got London and the hinterland around that with the donut, where people are still plugged into that, but they're able to kind of have better quality of life considerations in the sense of having a garden, having a home office, a garden office, and be able to commute less frequently. So you get choice there, but that comes with prosperity, comes with stage in life. And then your first point was about that dramatic change. And I'm always I kind of completely agree with you in the sense of we can think about the COVID crisis, we can think about the global financial crash in 2009. The idea is that we have a crisis and that fundamentally reorders things. But we see time and time again the resilience of the economic and geographical model that fits with that is very, very strong, in the sense that things revert back to the way they were. Quite quickly in most cases. So I shouldn't be shocked, actually, that the things haven't changed that much, even though it's quite depressing. Hebe?
Hi, David. Thanks. That was really interesting. And yeah, nice to see where the work is going. I was wondering if in any of your places that you were visiting, you came across people talking about how they might be trying to address sort of community cohesion in terms of new people coming in. And I was just thinking of this because we're doing some work in East Ayrshire with a community, working with the Community Development Trust, which I think would probably actually be a very cold spot on your area, the place where we're working. But they're really trying to make it attractive as a remote working area, and part of that is developing a co-working space, a community co-working space. And I was also thinking of this in terms of that quote that you had about the Victorian houses and the spare bedroom and stuff, and trying to address where that might not be the case, and if there would be things like co-working spaces that you came across being developed as a sort of reaction to that.
Yeah, I think in terms of that co-worker space, I think, at the start of the pandemic, there was there's a lot of assumption that these would spring up everywhere. And I think that hasn't necessarily transpired, in the sense that people either stay in their home and work, or else go to work. And this is the co-working spaces are an awkward in-between area. In some cases, I think in remote places, they could have better broadband connections in these places, which might attract people to go into them and things like that. But I think that point about community cohesion is interesting. And again, that probably pans out differently in different types of places. So again, thinking about the more prosperous parts of the donuts around London and things like that, you've already got quite prosperous places, and you've got more prosperous people moving to them. So I didn't get much of a sense of tension with that. Much more so, and this maybe relates to Reese's point as well, in the rural areas, and you'll be familiar, Hebe, from your own research, that and my own life experience, in rural areas, you've got this long-standing there's always been tensions, I think, between newcomers and existing residents. But this came out very strongly in a lot of the Scottish context, where you've got probably a tension between the things that attract the incomers are the very quiet pace of life, things that don't change very much. They're authentic and very rural. Then you've got existing residents who are keen for development. They want better roads, they want better facilities to attract economic development. So the incomers do want things to change, and the existing residents do want change in that respect. And there's a tension there, I think, and also in terms of, I've got some nice quotes in the paper, actually didn't put in today just for time reasons, where basically you've got people talking about the new people coming either don't involve themselves with the community, they keep themselves to themselves, or they become very proactively involved, in the sense that they're confident public speakers, they've got like professional jobs and things like that as well, so they maybe dominate the community council, and that has an impact on the type of activities which are going on. So I remember a really interesting quotation from someone from the community council in Campbelltown, basically the end of the Mull of Kintyre, very, very remote. And he was basically saying that a lot of the locals complain about the incomers, doing all this kind of stuff. But at the same time, the locals, he said, aren't keen to do this sort of stuff as well. So I think there's that long-standing tension, but it's probably been exacerbated by COVID, in the sense you get an influx of these types of people who are wealthy and quite confident when it comes to doing this sort of stuff. So these tensions already exist, but probably been exacerbated a bit, I think, by the recent changes.
Great, thanks, David.
Anyone else want to comment or have a question? We've got a population geography research group meeting in 4 minutes, but I'm happy to chat. I like this topic, so we could talk about it for a long time.
I think we should give you a chance to breathe a little bit. You've been presenting and answering questions in yeah, exactly.
Okay, we've got water. It'll be okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming along. And any questions afterwards, please just drop me a line. And yeah, look out for the paper in due course. Hopefully, eventually. Well, thanks much, everyone. I'll see some of you in 4 minutes. Thank you. Thanks. Cheers. Thank you. Bye.